Welcome, everyone. We wait a few minutes just to make sure that everyone has time to log in. But in the meantime, thank you for joining us for Building Castles on Shifting Sand, Leading LIS Education Programs That Last. All right, let's go ahead and get started. Welcome again. Thank you for joining us for Building Castles on Shifting Sand, Leading LIS Education Programs That Last. Before I introduce our speakers, I have a few housekeeping items to go over. You are all in listen-only mode, but that doesn't mean you can't communicate with us. If you want to, you can use the chat module in the GoToMeeting console. And there is a questions module in the GoToMeeting console as well. If you have questions, we will gather up all your questions and we will hold them until the end. So when you have questions, if you are thinking of them, type them in, and then we will go back once Ken and Lisa have finished presenting to review those questions as a group. The webinar is being recorded and it will be posted to the LIS website after the presentation. Handouts and slides will be distributed after the presentation in the website recording. And that, I believe, is all the housekeeping I have for you. So I will go ahead and introduce our speakers today. We are joined by Lisa G. O'Connor, who is the chair and associate professor at the University of North Carolina, Greensboro. She's entering her second year as chair. She formerly taught at the University of Kentucky for 12 years and was a practicing academic librarian for 10 years. She teaches human information behavior and information literacy, and she's published research on information seeking and the interaction of information and financial literacy. She earned her MLIS from the University of South Carolina and her PhD in the Cultural Foundations of Education from Kent State University. That's Lisa. Our next speaker is Ken Haycock, who is a research professor at the University of Southern California. Ken Haycock has led 3 different graduate schools, including the University of British Columbia, which developed a First Nations concentration, a dual MLIS-MAS program, a multidisciplinary MA in children's literature, and a PhD program under his tenure. San Jose State University, under his tenure, grew to 3,000 graduate students in 14 countries while receiving recognition for quality assurance. And the University of Southern California was the first new LIS program in a research institution in decades, the first distance-only LIS program, and the first in a school of business achieving full accreditation in record time. So that is Ken Haycock. Lisa will be giving us the first presentation, so we will turn it over to Lisa.
Thanks very much, Denise. Hi, everyone, and thanks for coming. I want to put this in context by telling you that this will be sort of the microcosm. This is my personal story of my first year of leadership, and Ken will be looking at it from a broader perspective. I have to start by telling you that I actually never wanted to do this. This was never in my plan. I believed I would retire as a faculty member quite happily. I had no aspirations to it. I applied to UNCG as a faculty member, and the universe conspired to convince me to take this position as chair. And even after I said yes, I had my doubts. But I will tell you, it's the best decision I've ever made in my life, and it's been an amazing year. And so I will tell you a little bit about that. So I've done a lot of reflecting over the past couple months about what prepared me. I've stepped into this role just feeling a surprising amount of preparation for it. I never would have guessed that. And as I look back, it's some things that you wouldn't guess. So the first is actually being a mother of 2 children and running a career at the same time. The skills that I got from that were the ability to do sort of everything at once, keep all the balls in the air, and still look towards the future. It also taught me to let go of perfection, to understand when my best work was necessary and when sometimes it's a matter of just getting things done and surviving the day with no harm done to anyone. But it was also about relinquishing control of the things that you don't really have control of anyway. And the other thing motherhood prepared me for is that we faculty occasionally act like children. I'm mostly kidding about that, but anyway. So some of the other things that I did in my professional career that prepared me well for this was being on a Dean's and Directors Review Committee. On those committees, I learned a lot about the bottom line frustrations that faculty have with leadership. It's not what I would have thought. Some of the frustrations that came out the most insistently were a frustration with leaders who are unwilling to confront situations head on, a lack of courage, I guess you'd say, sort of an unwillingness to make a real decision and stick with it. And the third, I think, was favoritism or perceived favoritism. So I went into my year knowing that those were important issues to confront. These things prepared me only in hindsight, because before I took this role, they actually are what scared me. I equated these sorts of leadership skills, I think, with traditionally male styles of leadership. So arrogance, sort of, or overconfidence, emotional distance, brutal honesty, some of the things we traditionally think about when we think about powerful people. And frankly, I think in academia, there is this association of cleverness with intelligence. Robert Sutton calls it assholery, and it's often conflated with intelligence and ability, and it seems to have some social capital in academia. So that I didn't see myself in that leadership model at all. And it worried me. I thought that maybe I couldn't actually be a good leader. The other things that I did were participate in the college level strategic planning process. Gave me a real good sense of how the department functioned within the larger institution, and of how the planning process works, or how it should work. I was lucky enough to be in a situation where it was done well. Also, working on the accreditation team prepared me well for what I would have to face as a department chair. Perhaps the most valuable experience that I had at the University of Kentucky, though, was serving on the faculty senate, and particularly on the curriculum committee, where I learned a great deal about the politics of the Titanic, that is academia, and the importance of laying the groundwork for change through relationships that are built on trust. And I piloted an undergraduate gen ed course recently at my institution, which is something that can be fiercely territorial. But the lessons that I learned through this work on the curriculum committee enabled me to create all those relationships I needed before the first proposal even came through. And that proposal, as a result, it flew through the process, was very easy, took months, and we now have a required gen ed course on campus in information competence. So that relationship building process I will take with me in everything I put forward from now on. I guess my advice with all that would be to say yes to things. If you're not in this role yet, say yes to things, even if they don't look like things that might prepare you. You might be surprised. So I would also say that this isn't what necessarily I thought it would be. There were a lot of surprises, and I'll share some of those with you. When I first went to my interview at the University of North Carolina, Greensboro, and I was meeting with the 5 other chairs, department chairs in the School of Education, they asked me pointedly why I hadn't originally applied for the chair's position. And I told them that I just had never thought of myself that way. I wasn't really interested in amassing any power. And they all laughed very loudly and said, well, it's a good thing because you won't have any power in this job. You'll only have responsibility. And I learned 2 things in that moment. The first was that I was going to have a really great bunch of colleagues to mentor me through the chairship. And the second thing I learned is that, that's when I began to think, maybe I could do this. Maybe I was situated well for it. The thing that probably surprised me most is sort of the loneliness and isolation that can come with this. Perhaps this comes largely from switching institutions at the same time, but you can't go into this forming the same kinds of relationships you would if you were just a faculty member. So there's a bit of isolation. It's hard to find people to talk to that you can talk with freely. I also was surprised by sort of what I call the they syndrome. I found that when I interact with students and faculty, there's a lot of they thinking. So the administration is they who do these things that just make me unhappy. And I would say, well, no, wait, there's no they. It's me and my administrative assistant, and we're doing this, and we're making decisions, and we need your input. It's we. So I guess that contributed to the feelings of isolation. And I also learned that the nature of the work wasn't what I thought. So for the first several months, I kept thinking, well, if I could find a day where I'm not putting out fires all day, I could get my real work done. Then one day it occurred to me that this fire putting out was actually a big part of the work. And so I began to schedule myself time away from those fires when I shut off my email and make time to do the other work that I wasn't able to do. The other thing that really surprised me was the lack of control of so much of the workflow. Academic culture, I've learned, is sort of like an avocado. It's not ripe, not ripe, not ripe. You must eat it today. And this happens all the time in this role. So you wait and you wait and you wait for things to happen. And then, boom, somehow it's an urgent situation and the deadline is a week from now and the work has to be done quickly. So that's been an interesting realization for me. So some of the lessons that I've learned from all of this. The first is that it really is okay to be authentic. Uber's new CEO made big headlines when he said, "I have to tell you, I'm scared about this opportunity." And there's a lot of discussion about vulnerability around that. And this is something I read right before I stepped in his chair, and I have taken that lesson to heart. And when I am uncomfortable, when I am scared, I actually do regularly admit that. And it gives me a great sense of comfort to be able to admit it to people. I think it creates an environment where it's okay to be afraid of taking risks. And I think it also creates an environment where it's okay to innovate, because innovating, as we all know, means taking risks to fail. So I really think no matter what your personality is, you can prepare yourself to do this. You don't have to be that traditional leadership model that we all think of. I've also learned, I think, that honesty is rarer, harder, and more effective than I ever thought it would be. It's not the kind of brutal honesty that you think of in terms of assholery, as he put it, but when honesty comes from a good place, from pure motivations and compassion, I've been amazed at how well people have taken it. I've had 3 or 4 moments during the past year where I had to tell someone very honestly that they had done a poor job or had not handled something right, and I was terrified of it. But I felt that I had to make a real commitment to being completely honest about it, that was part of my job. And in every case, I've been amazed at what it achieved with the person. And I know that won't always be the case. Some people will resent it no matter what. But more often than not, people appreciate the courage that it takes for you to be completely honest with them. I also learned to moderate my expectations. So in the beginning of my tenure, I heard lots of bad things about various faculty from other faculty. People love to talk and sort of, in their mind, prepare you for what you're going to learn. And I made a real conscious decision in the very beginning not to act on any of that, to put it all aside. Now, in the end, some of those things end up being true, but the fact that I didn't act on them from the beginning made a lot of difference in how faculty perceived my treatment of them. I really did start with a trust for everyone, and until you break it. I think that one of the biggest skills that I'm refining now is learning how to maximize everyone's strengths and minimize the harm that their weaknesses can do to the workplace. And if I can get that down and do it well, I think I will have gone a long way to creating a great department. The other thing that I learned is that most fires are slow burning. When people come to you with something that has to be taken care of immediately, it rarely is true that you have to jump. I found that in the beginning, I made a few decisions too quickly, and it wasn't necessary. So I've learned to take my time, gather data, gather all the perspectives I need, and take the time that I need to reflect on it before responding. That rarely has been a bad strategy. And mentoring. I thought when I looked for a mentor, what I would need is someone to tell me what to do and give me the answers. But in fact, actually, what I've needed is someone who would listen to me talk, but with an educated ear, with an understanding of what I'm going through. I found that through all the campus governance and even with my dean and other chairs, there's actually very little time to talk about what you're experiencing. So having a few good people in my life who've been where I am, who can listen and reflect with me on what I'm going through, has actually been key. Now, I've also had mentors who've been just great role models. I've read books. One that really has stuck with me is Why Women Should Rule the World by D.D. Myers. That's been instrumental. So I have had role models, but I've also needed people who just simply listen. And finally, I think one of the biggest things I learned is understanding what you don't control and continuing to care for yourself. If you let yourself just be swallowed into the day-to-day stresses, it's like that oxygen mask on the airplane. If you don't take care of yourself, you can't really do a good job. This is something I'm still working at, is finding that balance with my personal life and self-care. I'm not there yet, but I think it's really critical. And finally, I think that I can't go to the final slide for some reason. Thank you. I think that finding the right pot for me was everything in terms of my blooming and my growth. It's, I think, the single greatest reason that I've had some success this year. And it's because my values truly aligned with those of that department. I chose really wisely. Like choosing a good partner, I chose the right environment for me. At the end of the day, my colleagues and I, we might disagree on the procedures or the small aspects, but in the long run, I know that we're actually all headed in the same direction, and that makes everything so much easier. It means a lot less conflict. In my previous institution, there was less symmetry between what I thought was important and what the department thought was important, and I think it would have been very difficult to lead. So if you decide to do this, choose very carefully and make sure you find the right spot for you. That's what I have, and I believe we'll take all the questions at the end. So I will give it over to Ken.
Thank you. Lisa, you provided some excellent examples of the things that I'll be talking about. So I'm very grateful for them and for your personal story. I'd also just like to make it clear that while I'm going to provide a number of examples, they are taken from stories that I've heard over the years. So they aren't necessarily from places where I have been the director. So I don't want you to draw that conclusion in any way. What I'm going to do is really focus on a kind of belief that I have that we should engage to the extent possible in fire prevention as much as we can. Is my screen showing? I'm sorry, it's a little unclear from what I'm seeing.
Yes, Ken, we can see your screen.
And just the main slide?
I am seeing predicting sustainability for programs in library and information science.
Thank you. I'm sorry, but there was a confusion on my screen. I apologize for that.
Sure, it looks like you just need to maximize it or go into presentation mode.
And that's what I've done just now, but it doesn't seem to be. Can you see it, just the one slide now?
I'm still just seeing it like it's in edit mode, but I can pop it up on my screen if that's easier.
Well, let me just. Okay, if you don't mind.
I see it now.
Okay, thanks. I apologize for that confusion. I'm going to look at predictors for sustainability, and this is based on a study that I conducted a few years ago that looked at the literature, not only in LIS, but also in schools of education, schools of social work, and schools of nursing, and to see whether there are any common factors that would predict to some extent what influence continuance and discontinuance. And once those predictors were established, there were 14 of them, they were approved by the LIS Board of Directors. And then I conducted a survey of deans, directors, and program chairs who validated the 14. No one had any issue with any of the 14. Some had personal preferences based on their own context, but they were all validated. And so what I'd like to do is go through them briefly and then talk about what I think are some of the implications for these particular factors. So looking at the first ones then, the single most important factor in the continuation of a program is its congruence and alignment with the parent institution. That seems pretty obvious, but as Lisa pointed out, understanding the planning process of the larger institution is critical for aligning oneself with that institution's mission. It relates to the strategic importance of the program and its impact, and really its centrality to the parent organization. I have found even starting the program's mission statement or statement purpose with the beginning phrase in support of the mission statement of the University of whatever, and then go on to yours, has led to it being recognized by provosts in 2 institutions where I work for its connection with the overarching mission. I'd even say that some writers in strategic planning today even suggest you should just start with the parent organization's mission and see how you can fit into that, and then add those few things that are unique to your own organization. So that centrality is critical. The leadership of the unit is also critical in terms of the things that Lisa mentioned, and also ensuring that there's some connection with one's peers. And one's peers are not necessarily faculty, they're deans and directors in other units and in other organizations that reflect your particular situation. It's really critical that someone be diplomatic, but diplomacy is not just being wanting to be liked, it's being willing to have those courageous conversations, recognizing that you don't have power. But I would suggest that instead of power, a director or chair has enormous influence, at least potentially, and needs to know how to use that influence. And also understanding what the leverage points are within that particular organization. So I've worked for 2 major research institutions, and the kinds of things that were possible there were just not even worth considering in a teaching university. The context, where the organization is going, what the faculty are ready for, make a huge difference. And it's critical, I think, that we find ways to leverage the strengths that we have so that we in fact can profile those strengths across campus. It's important then that the dean, director, chair, I'll use the term director from now on without all 3, be aware of trends and issues and the opportunities in our field and within the institution. It's also important to have the connections with senior administrators on campus and invite them to events where they can in fact acknowledge faculty and others, students and others for what they're doing. The program, of course, has to be cohesive. I would suggest that not only does it has to be distinctive in terms of our own knowledge base, but it also has to be at the graduate level. Now that seems patently obvious, but I can tell you I've read and heard stories over my career of the kinds of things that we should be offering as either necessary for entry to our program or offered for 0 credit but required. We have to make sure that what we're doing is at the graduate level, both in intellectual depth and that the requirements that we have. I also think that a director, and faculty for that matter, but a director needs to know how to leverage that curriculum so it can have greater impact across the campus. A couple of examples: joint programs are the obvious things that we do. Joint degrees, even if they attract few students, has some important component to it as well. But I think we need to look at the kinds of courses that we offer in, for example, advanced reference in law, health, corporate intelligence, and change them into courses in strategic intelligence and make them available to students in those units across campus. So a student in law can take a course in strategic intelligence in law. A student in the health sciences can take a course in strategic intelligence in health, and so on. Similarly, I think that we need to up our game in areas like storytelling, where we may have considerable strength, but we offer it only for children in public libraries when the principles are the same for storytelling in the courtroom, storytelling in the organization. And we could offer those programs either as unique entities or based on the principles involved, and attract those who are interested in law, those who are interested in business, and those who are interested in working with young people in public libraries. The faculty, of course, are critical for sustainability, and we need to ensure that we're offering a current practice, because the students will certainly let us know if we're not. And I think a director has an obligation to ensure that there's continuing education opportunities for faculty, whether it's how to assess individual work in teams or different approaches to using online tools and techniques, whatever, but making those connections. I think that the director, too, who is typically more engaged with the rest of the university than individual faculty members, can find opportunities for faculty to connect with other scholars and to also apply for university-wide committees and task forces. This is important not only for visibility, it's also important to ensure that the faculty as a whole have a grasp of the issues facing the campus as a whole. I think that one of the issues that we have is that faculty gradually aren't as well connected with their state and national conferences, and don't see great opportunities for them to present in those venues. But I think a director has a responsibility to try and ensure there's at least one or two faculty at the state or provincial conference and at national conferences for visibility for the program, if for nothing else. One of the greatest challenges, of course, for faculty is to ensure that we get to the point where at least most faculty recognize that they're not a part of this unit simply as a great researcher and teacher in a particular area, but they're really a citizen of the school. They're part of a community contributing to a greater good, for which we're all accountable and we're all responsible. It's also obviously necessary to know what the critical mass is for student numbers. For some institutions where I've worked, student numbers drive revenue, which drives faculty positions. In others, the number of faculty positions are determined, and that drives the number of students unit can accommodate. In any event, we need to make sure that we're consistent and congruent with what's happening across the campus itself. Any good leader will have worked with faculty to know what the priorities are for any positions that come vacant, and to review that on a regular basis with faculty. It doesn't necessarily follow that when a faculty member retires or leaves in one particular area of expertise, that's the priority for replacement. Research funding is important in most of our institutions and increasingly important, and certainly in a research environment, it's critical that we attract external funding, at least to the same extent as similar units on campus. So who are those similar units and what are they attracting? This is really almost a surrogate of quality and perceived status on many campuses. So in some institutions, it's important that every faculty member, or most at least, apply for and one hopes are successful in gaining a national research grant. In others, it's not so important. Just by way of example, across the accredited programs, there are those where some faculty are teaching as much as 4 and 4 courses. 3 and 3 is the most common. There's one university where research faculty only teach 1 semester out of 3, and they're paid for 3 semesters, 12-month contracts. So you can imagine the standards are quite different for research funding between and among those institutions. It's also important that we see that there are other sources of revenue for the unit, whether it's offering an undergraduate program, attracting more students, offering an online option, or planned giving from alumni and others. And some are engaging in contracts as well and consultancies and count them towards the unit and set up centers to do that type of work. The issue is that in today's environment, we can't rely solely on the parent institution, but have to ensure that there are other sources of funds as well. And it's typically the director who does this. But I can tell you that you not only have to acknowledge the donations that are given, no matter how small, you have to stay in touch with those people as well if you want them to continue giving and to indeed increase the amount. And I give to 4 or 5 institutions where I've worked, and only 2 of them actually ever acknowledge the donation. And I stopped giving to 2 of them, and nobody's ever noticed it and called me. So that leaves me with the impression it wasn't all that important. So the relationship becomes very important as well. And these are, of course, in addition to what the organization is providing itself. The outcome measures can be very different from place to place, but in terms of program quality and status, employability is generally at least one consideration. For some, it's very important. For others, on the radar, but not critical. It's important to track metrics then and where they're being employed. It's also important to have a connection with alumni and the professional community and not leaving it to chance, but actually showing up. So in my experience, I've tried to find faculty who would connect with different groups of the professional community and also who would take responsibility for connecting with alumni and attending their events so that we do have that ongoing dialogue and connection. And they feel that they're part of our endeavor as well. Accreditation, about which I could say a great deal, having been through, count them, 6 different accreditation exercises in the last 5 years. It's a symbol of quality, but like many of these factors, it's not going to save a doomed program. But certainly getting a conditional or losing accreditation is going to have an effect on how the program is viewed in terms of its quality. So I want to just turn for a minute then to look at what is actually my view of the implications of some of these for leadership, for governance, and for accountability. And I hope that you might have some questions about these. The first, would I do some things differently that I did at the beginning of my career? Of course. Are there some things that I regret? Of course. But you can't relive, so you move on. So I would say that the one thing that I've learned that I think is critical to this entire conversation is the relationship is the message. The relationship is the message. The director needs a positive relationship. That does not mean that there won't be differences of opinion, but a positive relationship with the individual to whom he or she reports, with colleagues across campus, and of course with the faculty and students, as well as those stakeholders external to the organization. They need to build a political capital within the organization. And I would say that one of the critical questions that I've learned to ask for the people I report to is something like, what are your goals for the coming year or two? And how can you see that I can help you to accomplish them? This suggests you're interested, it suggests you're connected, and it suggests that you're going to help to lead your unit in a way that is congruent with the organization as a whole. There are a number of power groups external to the organization, including employers and alumni. And I would suggest that it's important in terms of governance that there be an advisory council. I think most have that. But I would suggest that the advisory council should include those individuals and perspectives that will help the school move forward. I've always felt it important to have on the advisory council somebody from the vendor community. The vendors in the library industry, if I can use that word, the library sector, tend to employ more of our graduates than any other single employer. I found it useful in the past to have a journalist on an advisory council, so they understand our program in case we ever got into difficulty with the parent organization. I think the advisory council, of course, includes faculty, but it includes employers as well, and students, of course. I have also found that it's been, for me at least, highly productive to dramatically reduce the number of committees in a school. I went to one school that had 27 committees and task forces, and I'm sure they were very productive and useful, having 2 or 3 people on them. But I've tried to collapse everything down to 4 committees. And I have found this to be very useful. One dealing with curriculum and programs, one dealing with faculty development and recruitment, one dealing with program resources, and one dealing with student admissions and adjudication. And on each of those committees is at least one full-time tenure-track faculty member, at least one adjunct part-time sessional faculty member, whatever term you use, at least one student appointed by the students, and at least one alumna or alumnus appointed by the Alumni Association. What I have found is that this gives faculty a broader perspective on the views of others and on a large area of the school's operations. Now, of course, there can be subcommittees that the chair chooses, but we've got 4 committees looking at broad areas of the school, and I've ensured that nothing goes to a faculty meeting that hasn't been reviewed and vetted through the appropriate committee. So it comes with some understanding, some thoughtfulness, and a recommendation about what might be done. I've also found that a school leadership committee that comprises the 4 chairs of those committees has been very helpful and as well in advising the director and ensuring that the director is in touch with all of those constituencies. For accountability, it's very important that there be metrics for the areas that I talked about in terms of those factors. What is the standard? What are we looking at? Who are we comparing ourselves to? I've also found it helpful to have 2 comparators on campus, in other words, units that are similar to us, and 2 comparators in LIS elsewhere. So you've got these comparators, you've got their metrics, and you can see where you fit. And then something for aspiration, both on campus. What is the STAR program that is most like you in terms of faculty numbers, student numbers, graduate work, and so on? And then one external. And I find that these metrics help very much in accountability and also for reporting. And reporting should be on a regular basis to the person to whom the director reports. I've always submitted a monthly report of only 2 pages. It has a standard format, and it finishes with issues or concerns that I would like to discuss. So I have a monthly meeting to discuss those, as well as what we've been doing for the previous month. And it keeps that dialogue open and communication going, and it's very important. One other last piece is that I've also found it quite useful to do away with weekly or monthly faculty meetings. And in the last 2 places I've worked, faculty meetings have been 1 to 2 days once a semester. One focusing on curriculum and programs, one on strategic planning, and one on assessment and review. And I find that when faculty are there for a concentrated period of time, the minutiae and administrivia has been dealt with, we focus on the area at hand, the committees have their reports ready to go, and we really get a broad overview of what we're doing, where we're going, and the progress that we're making. I think we're in a very exciting time, as you all know, in terms of the possibilities, but we tend to be smaller units on campus, and we have to be sure that we have the profile, we have the voice, and we have the reputation that is important for us moving forward. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Lisa and Ken. That was educational and frightening. I cannot actually see the audience, so if anybody does have questions, I'm going to rely on the LIS office to organize that, but I'm going to start out with a question. So my perspective is more that I have built my castle on eroding sand. The LIS program here is that our situation, I'm at the University of Missouri, is that the LIS program is a program with a program coordinator that we call ourselves program chairs, because program coordinators are effectively staff everywhere else. And I am still responsible for teaching the same load, researching the same load, service the same load, and I get a $5,000 pay bump for administration. And administration is a really big job. So I guess my question to you both would be, in this kind of situation, where would you see the avenue, where would you see the, I'm actually doing my entire planning here, where would you see the alliances that I would need to make, the questions that I would need to ask, and the relationships I would need to build? You can answer any or all of that. I'll be grateful for any advice.
Well, I tend to be a bit hard-nosed about this. So the first question I would ask, and you needn't respond, is why are you doing it? I think I'd be inclined to say to the person to whom I report, it sounds like it's a department chair, that the amount of work required is far beyond what would normally be expected of somebody in this kind of position in the other units within whatever the larger unit happens to be. And there's got to be some way that more support can be provided. That would be one way I would be looking at it. Another, I would say to my faculty colleagues, you know, it's pretty obvious that nobody wants to do this. One of us has to do it. I'm willing to, but we're each going to have to accept more responsibility in here than we would normally, or it's impossible for one or two people to do it. And here are some of the areas where I think we have to step up and take some responsibility. Personally, and I know I'm unusual in this case, I'd be inclined to say, you know, it carries a stipend of $5,000. I'm willing to hire a graduate research assistant to do some of the work with that money in order to help us here, but I can't do it myself. And if you are interested, you're welcome to it. I suspect you're not, so how are we going to make this work?
I agree, Ken. Actually, I think that there are very few things you can afford to take a big stand on, but I think if you take them wisely, they can work. So when I went into UNCG, they didn't have quite the same problem, but their enrollment had been increasing, and they had a lot of pressure from the graduate school and the former dean to just accept students, you know, without any attention to increase in resources. And when I got there, I sort of did a lot of background research, figured out what I thought was a reasonable faculty to student ratio, and I was willing to take a stand on it. And I said, look, you know, without additional resources, we're going to shrink our student population to this number, and we will not increase it until we have additional resources. And it worked. I have 2 new faculty lines this year in a single year. So I think sometimes it is worth saying, look, this isn't doable, and I'm not going to do it.
I also think that directors in particular have a lot of power that they don't realize. So, for example, this doesn't happen in every case, but often interested in this, I'm stepping down. Well, that leaves the person to whom that individual reports only one of two choices. One, another faculty member has to step up, unlikely, or a new faculty line has to be added, huge cost. So I think that sometimes we need to recognize, I've got a few cards here too. You could call my bluff, of course, and I have to live with that. But the reality is, I need some support here. There aren't a lot of options. People don't want these jobs. So how can we do this a little more appropriately? I also think that when somebody's applying for a job, and Lisa suggested this in terms of congruence of values, it's really important to point out, this is what I stand for. This is where I see some questions. Here are some things I'd like to explore with you. Here's some things that I would like to consider doing. And if you hire me, this is what you're getting. You have to understand that. If you aren't interested, don't go down that road.
Awesome. Okay, so we do actually have some questions. The first one is for you, Ken. Could you repeat the 4 committees you recommend for a department?
Well, they can be called different things, but essentially curriculum and program development, faculty development and recruitment, student admissions and adjudication, that's who gets the awards essentially. And lastly, program resources. So there's some transparency about the budget and what the needs are and that kind of thing. To use a cliche, which is stated in black and white terms, but there's a lot of gray, of course. The faculty control the curriculum, the director controls the budget, and so we dance. Well, I think there's more gray in there where the director can influence the curriculum from what he or she sees and observes and knows what needs might be. And also the faculty should have some considerable input into that budget and may not be determining who gets travel funds, but what the criteria are for graduate research assistantships if they're available, that kind of thing. And then reporting out by both. So those are the 4. And then I would have a school leadership team that included the 4 committee chairs.
Excellent, thank you. This is a question for both of you to chime in on. What are some of the most urgent challenges you observe among program leadership today?
I'll go, I guess, Ken, if that's okay with you.
Sure.
I think I see 2 that sort of I think about every day, and one is reflected in this discussion you've seen on Jesse lately. I think that it is a huge challenge for us to move forward and market the profession to be progressive, but maintain the values that have driven us all along. So, back in the 80s, Oldsmobile decided to go with a new campaign, and they were not your father's Oldsmobile, and they were going to be something new and different. And actually, they forgot what made them special to people, and they ceased to exist within a couple years. So I think it's achieving that balance of being forward-thinking, but in a way that we carry our values forward, the values that have made us important to people in the past. And then on a smaller level, for me, it's thinking about all the distance learners we have in our program now. We've gone from a purely face-to-face program in 2012 to a 78% distance learner program today. And I see a lot of discontent with distance learners about the lack of engagement they feel both with the program and the profession. And we try to do all kinds of things to integrate students and make them feel part. But the fact of the matter is that in many cases, they're working full-time jobs, they have kids, and they're trying to squeeze school in a very short time frame. So making sure those students are incorporated into the life of the school, making sure they get engaged learning experiences those are things that I think a lot about.
I see that there are two questions, one about program leadership and one about the whole question of students not willing to step up to management. So I'll try and answer both of those. I certainly agree with what Lisa had to say. I do think that one issue is faculty development. We don't really like to talk about it, but sometimes student learners in online programs are concerned about lack of feedback, they're concerned about timing of feedback, they're concerned about use of groups or teams, and I think those are the kinds of things where a director can make sure that what's on a faculty agenda includes best practices, support, and so on. I do think that depends on the institution, but I think that research funding, which is becoming more competitive, is a factor that is an indicator of quality. I think any good leader provides both pressure and support, but sometimes what we see as support, faculty see as pressure. For example, I worked somewhere where we needed to up our game in terms of research funding, and I managed to get the resources to hire a grant writer. I thought that was hugely supportive, but of course it was also inordinate pressure on faculty because then there was very little way of excuse in not to apply for grants. I think the resources are important in terms of increasing class size. When we're graduate programs, what is reasonable class size compared to other units? And I'd also say we have to get better at focusing on our uniqueness and not being shy about recommending students going elsewhere, even though we're competing for students. When I started at the University of Southern California, we were the first program to actually start as an online-only program. We had small student numbers, obviously, to start. And I wasn't shy about recommending students who wanted a program in archival science or wanted a program in information architecture. Here are 3 places you should look at. We are not in a position to offer these courses right now. And I think we need to stop thinking that each of 60 programs can be all things to all people, acknowledge our strengths, and say, if this is what you're looking for, we may not be the best fit for you. The last question is around management and leadership. Let me make 2 quick comments since we're running out of time. This is the last question I see. I think one of the problems begins with the faculty, and Lisa mentioned this. Faculty talk about they being the administration. They like the director personally or dean, but they don't like the administration, and they convey that to students. And so we get a student body that is anti-they, whoever they are. I'd also say that if you look at the core competencies recommended by the American Library Association, almost every major school has a tenure-track faculty member in each of those competencies, bar 1. And it's the whole management and leadership area. We tend to get adjuncts, 1 course. And instead of having somebody on faculty, as used to be the case, tenure track in that area, doing research in that area, and infusing it throughout the curriculum, like how to work effectively in teams, where there's a lot of solid research into how that should occur, and things like that. We're not having that faculty present generally around it. And then we get upset when non-LIS graduates are getting senior positions, when our own people aren't applying because they aren't interested. I think that's a huge area for us. Most of the research in leadership and management in our field right now is being done by the vendors. And I think that's shocking. It's no different than in medicine or pharmaceutical sciences, except for the critical life outcome result, which might be negative. But we're not doing our own research because we don't have a faculty in that area, and it's a serious issue in our field right now, in my view, which is why we started the Master of Management program in Library and Information Science at USC.
And I'll just add quickly that we're actually looking at mandating some kind of leadership experience in our final capstone course. So we're experimenting right now with a design by innovation process where we actually require students to go out into the field and take a leadership role in problem solving. So it's not such a foreign thing to them. So it's an experience for them. But I agree with you, it's a big challenge and one we have to address.
All right. Pardon me. Thank you very much. This has been awesome. I have learned a lot. I have I have gained answers to some of my very own questions. I would like to thank you both, Ken and Lisa, for your time and your willingness to present this topic, which is incredibly relevant to library schools today, as we've seen from discussions on Jessie. So thank you very much. Thank you to all of you who attended. Thank you to those of you who are listening to the recording. And you all have a great afternoon.